Hi, my name is Vivu Sakija, and this is my podcast, Never Shall I Forget, Echoes of Elie Wiesel's Night, for my ENG 4U culminating assignment on Night by Elie Wiesel. For my final product, I created a website that examined Night through 4 different critical lenses: the race lens, the powerless lens, the feminist lens, and the mental health lens. My website combined literary analysis with visual design so that I could communicate my ideas in a way that was organized and easy to follow. In this podcast, I will reflect on what I liked about the assignment, which part I enjoyed most, the difficulties I experienced, what I did successfully, what I learned, how I would assess my final work, and what I want to improve in the future. Question 1. What I like best about this assignment is that it allowed me to study Night from several different perspectives. In a regular essay, I would usually focus on one main argument. For this assignment, I was able to create separate ideas into 4 lenses and examine how each lens changed my understanding of the memoir. The race lens helped me focus on how Jewish people were targeted, separated, and treated as inferior because of anti-Semitism. The powerless lens helped me examine how the prisoners lost control over almost every part of their lives. The feminist lens made me think about the experiences of women and how their voices receive less attention because the memoir mainly follows Elie and his father. The mental health lens helped me understand the fear, grief, emotional numbness, loss of faith, and trauma that Elie experiences. I liked that the lenses were different but still connected. Racism was used to justify the persecution and the Nazis' control that made Jewish prisoners powerless. This treatment caused serious mental and emotional suffering. The feminist lens also showed that some experiences can remain less visible depending on whose story is being told. The assignment gave me more freedom than a normal essay because I could communicate these ideas through a website. I was still completing literary analysis, but I could organize it using different pages, headings, images, and sections. Question 2. When I look back at the assignment, the part I most enjoyed working on was creating the separate sections for each lens. I liked deciding what evidence belonged under each lens and how I could explain it without repeating the exact same argument. My favorite lens to work on was the mental health lens. The memoir contains many moments where Eli's thoughts and emotions change because of what he witnesses. At the beginning, he has strong faith and close relationship with his family. As the memoir continues, suffering, death, hunger, and fear affect how he sees himself, other people, and his faith. The final mirror scene was especially useful for the mental health lens. When Elie sees himself after liberation, he describes seeing a corpse looking back at him. I understood this more than the description of his physical condition. It also shows how disconnected he feels from the person he was before the camps. His appearance reflects the emotional damage and loss of identity caused by his experiences. I also enjoyed choosing visuals and organizing the pages. I tried to make the images support the meaning of each section instead of only using them to fill empty space. Since the subject was serious, I wanted the design to remain clear and respectful. I avoided using bright or distracting elements that would take attention away from the significant information. Question 3. The most powerful part of this assignment was separating ideas that could fit under more than one lens. The race and powerless lens had the most overlap. For example, Jewish people were identified and persecuted because of their race and religion, which connects to the race lens. However, the actions used against them, such as taking away their homes, possessions, names, freedom, and choices, also connect to the powerless lens. Instead of repeating the same explanation in both sections, I tried to change the focus. In the race section, I focused on why Jewish people were targeted. In the powerless section, I focused on how the Nazis gained and maintained control over the prisoners. The feminist lens was also challenging because Night mainly describes Eli's experiences with his father. His mother and his sisters are separated from him early in the memoir, so the reader receives fewer details about what happens to them. I had to avoid making claims that the memoir did not support. Instead, I focused on how women's experiences can become less visible when a story follows a male narrator. Another difficult part was deciding how much information to include on each website page. I wanted my analysis to be detailed, but too much writing would make the website difficult to read. I had to shorten certain sections and divide longer ideas into smaller paragraphs. Question 4. I was most successful at creating clear connections between events in Night and the 4 critical lenses. I tried to go beyond simply describing what happened after presenting an example. I explained what it revealed about racism, power, gender, or mental health. For the powerless lens, One of my strongest points was the loss of personal identity. In the camps, prisoners were treated like numbers instead of individual people. They lost their names, clothing, possessions, family connections, and the ability to make basic choices. This treatment made it easier for the Nazis to control them because the prisoners were no longer treated as full human beings. For the race lens, I explained that discrimination did not suddenly begin when Elie arrived at the concentration camp. Jewish families first faced restrictions, forced identification, removal from their homes, and confinement in ghettos. These events show how discrimination can become more severe when a government gives prejudice the force of law. I also think I successfully explained the mental health effects of Elie's experiences. His suffering affects his emotions, his trust in others, his relationship with his father, and his religious faith. This shows that survival is not limited to staying physically alive. A person can survive an event while continuing to carry its emotional effects. The organization of the website was another successful part. Giving each lens its own section made the information easier to follow and allowed the audience to understand the purpose of each page. Question 5. One thing I learned from this assignment was that critical lens changes the question a reader asks about a text. While reading through the race lens, I asked how identity affected the way different groups were treated. Through the powerless lens, I asked who had control, how that control was maintained, and what happened to people who had no ability to resist. Through the feminist lens, I asked whose voices received attention and whose experiences were less visible. And through the mental health lens, I asked how trauma affected Elie's thoughts, emotions, behavior, faith, and identity. The events in the memoir remained the same, but each lens directed my attention toward different details. This helped me understand that literary analysis is not only about identifying themes, it is also about choosing a perspective and using evidence to explain what the perspective reveals. I also learned that the design of a media product affects how clearly information is communicated. A website needs to be easy to navigate, and the audience should understand how the sections connect. The font, layout, paragraph length, images, and headings can either make the information easier to understand or make it more confusing. Question 6. I would assess my work on this assignment as good, with some parts that I believe reached the outstanding level. I believe my analysis was detailed and remained connected to Night. I completed all 4 lens sections and explained how one provided different understanding of the memoir. I also organized the website carefully and used visuals that connected with the written information. Another reason I would assess it as good is that I did more than summarize the plot. I explained why certain events mattered and why they showed about larger issues such as discrimination, control, ignored voices, and trauma. However, I would not say that every part was perfect. Some sections had more detail than others, and a few explanations could have been shorter and more direct. I also think I could have checked the consistency on the website more carefully, including the spacing, amount of text, and placement of visual elements. Overall, I believe the final product showed strong knowledge of the memoir, careful use of the critical lenses, and a serious effort to communicate my ideas clearly. Question 7. One thing I need to improve on in my next assignment is my planning before I begin creating the final product. For this assignment, I sometimes started writing a section before deciding exactly what evidence and analysis I wanted to include. This caused some sections to become longer than I originally planned. I then had to move information, shorten paragraphs, or remove repeated ideas. Next time, I would create a detailed outline before designing the final product. For each section, I would write down the main claim, the evidence I plan to use, the explanation of that evidence, and the visual element that will support it. This would help me keep the sections balanced. I would also leave more time for final editing. When working on a large project, it's easy to focus on finishing every required section and then rush through proofreading. A simple editing stage would help me find repeated ideas, awkward sentences, citation mistakes, and design problems. Question 8. One goal I would like to focus on in the future is making my analysis more direct without removing important details. Sometimes I take several sentences to explain an idea that could be stated more clearly. In future assignments, I want to begin each section with a focused claim, provide the strongest evidence, and then explain exactly how the evidence supports my point. I also want to become better at showing the connections between different ideas. Although the 4 lenses had separate sections, they were connected throughout the memoir. Anti-Semitism led to discrimination. Discrimination allowed the Nazis to take control. that control affected men and women in different ways, and these experiences caused lasting mental health and emotional harm. Showing these connections more often would make my overall argument feel more unified. It would also show that the lenses do not exist separately from each other. Different forms of discrimination and suffering can overlap within the same experience. Overall, this assignment helped me recognize both my strengths and the areas where I still need to improve. I believe my strongest skills were making connections, organizing information, and explaining the 4 lenses. My main areas for improvement are planning earlier, editing more carefully, and making some explanations more direct. Thank you for listening to my self-assessment podcast.